It began with an accident. At least, that's what the authorities called it. A routine road expansion project near the outskirts of town had unearthed something no one had seen before: a tunnel, old and untouched, stretching deep into the earth. There was no record of it in any geological survey, no mention of it in town archives. It simply existed, as if it had always been there, waiting. The workers, unnerved by the cold air that seeped from the opening, refused to go near it. Eventually, the site was abandoned, left behind like an open wound in the landscape. For weeks, rumors spread. Some said it was an old mining shaft, forgotten over time. Others whispered that it was a military installation, buried beneath the town decades ago. But then came the more sinister theories. Stories of people who had disappeared in the area long before the tunnel was found, of voices calling from below, of a presence that had been disturbed. At first, these were nothing more than local folklore, the kind of thing teenagers told each other around bonfires. But then the first person went missing. It was a boy, no older than 16. His friends claimed they had dared him to step inside, just past the entrance, just for a second. He did, and he never came out. Search parties combed through the surrounding woods, scoured every inch of the excavation site, but there was no trace of him. The tunnel had swallowed him whole. The authorities blocked off the entrance with heavy steel bars, but the damage was already done. The town knew. The tunnel was awake. I hadn't planned on investigating it myself. In fact, I had every intention of avoiding the entire subject. I wasn't a journalist chasing a story, nor an adventurer seeking a thrill. I was just someone who had come back to town for a funeral. My uncle, a historian who had spent years researching the area, had passed away unexpectedly. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but I knew better. He had been obsessed with something in the town's past, something he never talked about in detail. His death, coming so soon after the tunnel's discovery, didn't feel like coincidence. 2 days after the funeral, I found myself in his study, surrounded by books, old maps, and brittle newspaper clippings. It was there, tucked between pages of handwritten notes, that I found the first real clue. A drawing. It was crude, little more than a child's sketch, but unmistakable. A dark, gaping mouth in the earth, with tiny figures standing at its edge. And beneath it, scrawled in the frantic hand of someone who had been afraid, were 3 words: "It is listening." That night, I dreamed of the tunnel. I saw myself standing at its entrance, feeling the unnatural cold pressing against my skin. I heard the wind whispering through the darkness, carrying voices that spoke my name. And in the dream, I stepped forward, drawn by something I couldn't resist. When I woke up, my feet were dirty, my hands scraped as if I had been clawing at the ground. The sheets were damp with sweat, and the whispering still echoed in my ears. Despite everything, despite the fear curdling in my stomach, I had to see it for myself. I told myself it was just curiosity, that I needed closure after my uncle's death. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The tunnel had become a question I needed to answer, a door I couldn't leave shut. So, the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I drove out to the site. The metal barrier meant to keep people out had already been tampered with, the locks broken and discarded. Someone else had been here recently. The entrance yawned before me, a black void against the pale morning light. The air that drifted out was cold, far colder than it should have been, and it carried a scent that I couldn't quite place: damp earth, rusted metal, and something faintly sweet like decayed flowers. I stood at the edge, hesitating, my breath clouding in the unnatural chill. My uncle's warning, hidden in that frantic note, repeated in my mind. It is listening. But who or what was listening? The tunnel offered no answers, only the quiet hum of the unknown pressing against my thoughts. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A voice. Not loud, not distinct, just a whisper, curling around my name like a lover's breath against my ear. I spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was no one, just the wind, stirring the loose dirt around my feet. In the tunnel, waiting, the voice had been so soft, so intimate, that for a moment I doubted I had heard it at all. The rational part of my mind, the part that still clung to logic, told me it was just the wind, a trick of acoustics in an open space. But I knew better. It had whispered my name, drawn it out slowly, deliberately. The sound had carried weight, like something reaching through the dark, waiting for a response. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to abandon this place before it pulled me in any deeper. And yet, I didn't move. Instead, I found myself staring into the tunnel, into the absolute blackness beyond the entrance, feeling a pull I couldn't explain. My uncle's death, the missing boy, the warning scrawled in his notes, everything pointed to this place. If I turned back now, I would never stop wondering. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone to use as a flashlight. The moment I turned it on, the beam of light cut into the darkness, illuminating rough, uneven walls of ancient stone. The passageway was narrow, just wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. The air inside was colder than before, carrying the weight of something old and undisturbed. Dust swirled in the light, catching the movement of my breath. I took a step forward, then another. The tunnel swallowed the sound of my footsteps almost immediately. It was like walking into a void, where even the air felt heavier, pressing against my skin with something I could only describe as awareness. My flashlight flickered, just for a second, but long enough to send a pulse of dread through my body. I tightened my grip on it, trying to steady my breathing. As I moved deeper, the walls changed. At first, they were rough and natural, like an old cave, but soon they became smoother, as if carved by human hands. Strange markings covered the stone, etched deep into the surface. They weren't letters, at least not any alphabet I recognized. Symbols, spirals, shapes that made my brain ache when I tried to focus on them. Some looked hastily scratched, while others had been deliberately chiseled, their precision unsettling. A few feet ahead, something gleamed in the dim light. I knelt down, brushing away the loose dirt to reveal what looked like a rusted buckle, attached to a torn strip of fabric. My stomach twisted. It wasn't old. The fabric was relatively fresh, the kind of material from a modern jacket or backpack. Someone had been down here recently. Maybe the missing boy. Maybe someone else. The whispering started again. This time it wasn't my name. It was lower, less distinct, a murmur threading through the air like distant voices overlapping in conversation. I swung my flashlight wildly, expecting to see movement, but the tunnel remained empty. The whispering didn't stop. If anything, it grew stronger, surrounding me, sinking into my bones. I turned to leave. I had seen enough, more than enough. But as I pivoted back toward the entrance, I froze. The passage behind me was different. The rough, natural walls that had framed my way and were now smooth and polished, covered entirely in those same symbols. The air had shifted, heavier now, thick with something unseen. My pulse pounded in my ears. I walked faster, retracing my steps, but the entrance, where was the entrance? My flashlight cast long, sharp shadows, but they revealed nothing ahead except more tunnel, stretching endlessly. The way I was gone, it had been there minutes ago, and now it simply wasn't. The tunnel had changed. I wasn't just inside it anymore. I was inside something else, and it was awake. I stood there, gripping my flashlight with white-knuckled hands, struggling to keep my breathing steady. The walls were wrong. The tunnel was wrong. I had walked in less than 5 minutes ago, and already, the passage behind me had shifted into something unfamiliar. There was no logical explanation for it, but then again, logic had no place here. Panic clawed at my throat. I turned in circles, the light bouncing off the strange, symbol-covered walls. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, that wasn't possible. The tunnel had been a straight shot inward, no branches, no twists. And yet, the exit was gone. Or worse, it had never been there at all. I forced myself to breathe. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think. The tunnel wasn't endless. It had a beginning, which meant it had an end. If I kept moving forward, maybe I'd find another way out. Maybe I'd even find the missing boy. The thought of him, lost and afraid somewhere in this place, made my fear feel small in comparison. I had come here for answers. Now I needed to survive long enough to get them. I pressed forward, my footsteps unnervingly silent on the stone floor. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the weight of something listening, watching. The markings on the walls became denser as I moved deeper. At first, they were just scattered shapes, but now they seemed deliberate, forming a pattern I didn't understand. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something metallic like rusted iron. Then I saw it, a door. It was set into the rock as if it had been built into the tunnel itself, its edges perfectly aligned with the unnatural smoothness of the walls. Unlike the rest of the passage, the door wasn't stone. It was made of something dark, almost black, and covered in the same cryptic symbols. A single handle jutted out from the center, polished and gleaming as if someone had touched it recently. My heart pounded. There shouldn't be a door here. The tunnel was supposed to be an empty, forgotten space. And yet, this door stood before me, waiting. I reached out, hesitating only for a second before gripping the handle. The metal was ice-cold beneath my fingers. I twisted it slowly, expecting resistance. But the door swung open with an unsettling ease. Beyond it, there was no tunnel, no walls, no floor, just darkness. Vast and yawning, stretching into nothing. It wasn't empty, though. Something was moving inside, just beyond the threshold. I couldn't see it, not fully, but I felt it. A presence shifting, waiting. Then, in the silence, a voice, low and distorted, rising from the abyss. You were never supposed to find this place. I slammed the door shut. I pressed my back against the door, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The voice still echoed in my mind, hollow and reverberating, as if it hadn't just been heard but absorbed. My fingers trembled as they remained clamped around the handle, afraid that if I let go, whatever lurked in that abyss would rip the door open and drag me inside. The tunnel remained silent, but not in the way an empty space should be. It was a silence with texture, a silence with weight. The walls felt alive. I couldn't explain it, but I swore I saw the faintest movement in the stone, as if the surface pulsed with something just beneath. I had to get out. I had to move. Pushing off the door, I aimed my flashlight down the passage ahead. The symbols on the walls were no longer scattered. They were arranged in a perfect sequence, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The more I stared, the more they seemed to shift, twisting in ways that made my head ache. I forced myself to look away. I walked faster, refusing to look back. My footsteps had an eerie quality to them now, like they weren't entirely mine. Sometimes there was an extra shuffle of movement, a faint echo that didn't match my pace. I ignored it. I had to. If I acknowledged it, that would make it real. The air grew thicker the deeper I went. Not just colder, denser, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. My lungs felt heavier with every breath, as if I were inhaling something more than air. It carried a strange scent now, not just damp earth, but something sharp, something organic, something rotting. Then I heard it, a wet, shuddering breath. I stopped dead. It wasn't my own. It came from up ahead, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the light as I slowly lifted it. The tunnel was empty, but the breath continued. Slow, ragged inhalations coming from somewhere close. Too close. My skin crawled as a terrible realization settled over me. The sound wasn't coming from ahead. It was coming from the walls. I recoiled, stumbling backward as I swept the beam of light across the stone. The symbols, God, they weren't just symbols. They were moving, shifting as if written on something that wasn't solid. The stone itself expanded and contracted like a great lung, inhaling and exhaling. The whispering started again, threading through the heavy air, weaving around me in a language I didn't understand but somehow knew was meant for me. I turned and ran. The tunnel stretched impossibly long, far longer than it had been before. No matter how fast I moved, the exit didn't appear. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. And then light. A flicker ahead, small but real. I sprinted toward it, my heart slamming against my ribs. The passage twisted, narrowed, but I pushed through until I reached the source. A lantern. An old, rusted lantern sitting on a flat rock, its flame impossibly steady despite the heavy air. Someone had left it here. Someone had been down here before me. And scrawled on the stone beneath it, carved deep into the surface, was a message. Don't let it follow you home. The words carved into the stone sent a chill racing down my spine. Don't let it follow you home. I traced the grooves of the message with a trembling finger, the warning fresh, deliberate. Someone had been here before me. Someone who knew what lurked in this place. The lantern flickered, its glow pulsing faintly, as if reacting to my presence. It was old, rusted, yet still burning. The idea of taking it felt wrong, but the light was the only real thing in this tunnel that hadn't twisted into something else. Without it, I was just a shadow stumbling through darkness. I picked it up. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, the temperature dropped. The whispers that had been distant before surged into a murmur, pressing against my ears, thick and suffocating. I turned sharply, scanning the tunnel, but nothing had changed except for one thing. The door. The black, ancient door I had shut behind me was now open. I hadn't heard it move, hadn't felt the air shift, but there it was, gaping wide, its threshold swallowed in darkness. The same presence from before lingered there, unseen yet impossibly present. I could feel it watching me, studying me. Then something stepped forward. I didn't see its full form, only a fraction of it, just enough to shatter whatever fragile grasp on reality I had left. A leg, impossibly thin, jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Fingers that stretched too long, curling against the edges of the doorframe. The air around it rippled, as though reality itself was trying to reject it. The whispers rose into a deafening chorus. I stumbled back, my grip tightening around the lantern. The light flared, burning brighter than before, and for the first time, I saw it react. The thing recoiled slightly, its form flickering like a warped reflection on water. It feared the light. That was all I needed to know. Without hesitation, I turned and ran, holding the lantern out before me like a shield. The tunnel shifted beneath my feet, the walls bending and pulsing, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Somewhere behind me, a sound echoed through the passage. Not a whisper this time, not breathing. Laughter. Low and distorted, it followed me, twisting in pitch, as if it were amused. As if it had let me go. But as I ran, the message carved into the stone played over and over in my mind. Don't let it follow you home. Because something told me that even though I had escaped the tunnel, I hadn't left alone. I didn't stop running until the tunnel gave way to the outside world. The air hit me like a wave, thick with the scent of wet earth and the promise of rain. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I forced myself to keep moving until I was well beyond the entrance. Only when I reached the tree line did I dare to look back. The entrance stood there, unchanged, as if it had never been disturbed. The rusted lantern in my grip was the only proof that I had been inside at all. The thought made my stomach twist. Had I imagined it? The whispers, the breathing walls, the thing in the doorway. Had my mind fractured in the darkness? No. The laughter still echoed in my head. That had been real. Too real. I turned and hurried toward my car, parked just beyond the hill. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, stretched-out shadows over the landscape. As I reached for the door handle, a strange sensation crept up my spine. It was subtle at first, just a prickle of unease, but the longer I stood there, the stronger it became. I wasn't alone. The trees around me were silent. No wind rustling through the leaves. No birds calling. Just stillness. Watching stillness. My breath came out in short bursts as I scanned my surroundings. Nothing was there. Nothing I could see, at least. Swallowing hard, I yanked the car door open and threw myself inside. I locked the doors out of instinct, though I doubted a lock could do much against whatever had been lurking in that tunnel. The lantern sat in the passenger seat, its flame impossibly steady despite the movement. I shoved the key into the ignition, my fingers shaking as I turned it. The engine roared to life, breaking the oppressive silence. As I pulled onto the road, My grip on the wheel was iron tight. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every sound. The further I drove, the more I told myself that I was safe now, that the thing, whatever it was, had stayed behind. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw it. Not a figure, not a face, just a shadow. But it wasn't mine. It stretched unnaturally long against the road behind me, shifting as if it didn't belong to the trees or the setting sun. It moved with me, followed me. The warning carved into the stone slammed into my mind again. Don't let it follow you home. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, tires screeching against the pavement. My breathing was erratic as I twisted around, expecting, dreading, to see something standing there. But there was nothing. The road behind me was empty. The shadow was gone. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity before forcing myself to move. Slowly, I put the car in drive and eased forward, my heartbeat still hammering in my chest. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe my nerves were playing games with me. But as I neared my home, one thought gnawed at the back of my mind. Shadows don't just disappear. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending in ways that defied logic. My headlights cut through the growing darkness, but it was as if the night itself was watching me, pressing in, waiting. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the unease had settled into something heavier, an invisible weight pressing down on my chest. My house stood in its usual place, quiet and unassuming, yet something about it felt different. Off. The windows reflected the streetlights, their glass dark and unreadable, like hollow eyes staring back at me. I stepped out of the car, lantern in hand. The flame inside it still burned, steady and unwavering, as if untouched by time. I didn't know why I had brought it with me. Maybe I was afraid to leave it behind. Maybe some part of me knew I would need it. The moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I felt it. A shift, a presence. The air was colder than it should have been. The house smelled the same. Wood, faint traces of coffee, the lingering scent of the rain that had started falling outside. But something was missing. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the faint creaks of the old floorboards settling, the distant sound of a car passing on the street, gone. It was as if the world had emptied itself, leaving only silence. I set the lantern down on the kitchen table and rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the chill. It was just my nerves. That was all. The tunnel had gotten under my skin. I just needed sleep. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, like a breath against my ear. My body went rigid, and I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty room. Nothing. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, checking the doors, the windows. Everything was locked, secure. I was alone, except the whisper came again. This time it wasn't distant. It was inside the walls. A chill ran down my spine as I pressed my ear against the drywall. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the longer I listened, the more I realized it was real. Murmurs, shifting just beyond the surface, like voices trapped in the hollow spaces between the wood and plaster. They were speaking, but the words were indistinct, layered over each other in a chaotic, rhythmic murmur. Then, all at once, they stopped. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The silence that followed was worse. It was waiting. I turned back to the lantern. Its flame still burned, but something was different now. The light cast shadows on the walls, stretching them in unnatural ways, making them move when they shouldn't have. And among those shadows, one stood apart from the rest. Not a trick of the light, not my imagination. A figure, standing, waiting, watching. And then, just as quickly as I had seen it, it was gone. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My body was frozen, my mind caught between the rational and the impossible. The figure in the shadows had been real. I knew it, felt it in the marrow of my bones. But now, the walls were still, the house silent once more, as if daring me to question my own sanity. Slowly, I reached for the lantern. Its flame was still unnaturally steady, casting a soft glow around the room. I tightened my grip on its handle, the warmth of the metal grounding me. Whatever had followed me from that tunnel, if something had followed me, I wasn't going to let it creep through my home unchecked. I moved through the house carefully, my ears straining for the faintest sound. The whispering had stopped, but the weight of something unseen pressed against me with each step. I checked the living room first, my eyes darting to the darkened windows. The outside world looked normal. Quiet suburban streets, distant streetlights flickering in the misty night. But I knew better. The hallway leading to my bedroom stretched out before me, darker than it should have been. The overhead light flickered as I approached, humming with electricity before stabilizing. I held my breath as I stepped inside, and then I saw it, my bedroom mirror. I had walked past it 1,000 times, had seen my reflection countless nights before, but this time, something was wrong. My reflection was there, but it wasn't mine. It looked like me. It moved like me. But the eyes, there was something in the eyes. A vacancy, a depth too unnatural to belong to anything living. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I lifted my hand. The reflection followed, but the movement was just off. Half a second too slow, deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. I stepped closer. It did the same. The breath in my chest hitched as I reached up toward the glass. My fingertips hovered just over the surface, the cold radiating against my skin. My own face stared back, still silent, waiting. Then it smiled. I jerked away so violently that I knocked the lantern onto the dresser, the flames sputtering but not going out. My reflection was smiling, wide and unnatural, teeth gleaming beneath lips stretched too far. My own face shouldn't be able to make that expression. I staggered back, slamming into the bedroom doorframe. My reflection's head tilted, still smiling, still watching. Then, without breaking eye contact, it raised one hand, fingers curling, beckoning me forward. A whisper slithered through the room, soft as a breath against my neck. "Let me in?" I didn't scream. I couldn't. I turned and fled, the lantern swinging wildly in my grip as I bolted from the room. My feet barely touched the floor as I ran down the hallway, past the silent walls, past the waiting shadows. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, wrenching it open with trembling hands. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I stumbled onto the porch, my breath ragged, my pulse hammering in my throat. The house loomed behind me, dark and still, but I knew I wasn't alone in there anymore. Something had followed me home, and now it wanted in. The cold night air was a shock, but it did nothing to quiet the pounding in my chest. I stood on the porch, my breath fogging in front of me, every nerve in my body screaming to run. But where? There was nowhere to go, nowhere that felt safe. My house stood behind me, silent and dark, but I knew something unnatural lurked inside. My reflection, the whispers in the walls, the shifting shadows. I wasn't imagining this. Something had followed me home. I turned to the street, half expecting to see some sign of life, some proof that the rest of the world was still real. But the neighborhood was empty, the streetlights buzzing faintly, casting pools of weak light onto the damp pavement. Everything felt too still, unnaturally so. The lantern flickered in my grip. I looked down at it, my knuckles white around the handle. The flame inside still burned, steady and untouched by the wind. I had taken it from the underground tunnel, and now it felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I didn't understand why, but I wasn't about to let go of it. Then, from inside the house, a knock. Not at the front door, not at the windows. A single, deliberate knock against the inside of the wall. I stiffened, my stomach twisting into a knot. The sound was faint but unmistakable. It came again, this time from deeper inside the house, from somewhere near the hallway. 3 slow, hollow knocks against the plaster. Knock, knock, knock. My breath hitched. My mind raced. I had locked all the doors, checked every window. No one should be in there. No one but me. And yet, the sound continued, moving from one wall to the next, creeping closer, as if something unseen was testing the boundaries of my home, testing me. I forced myself to step forward back toward the open doorway. The air inside was cold, a deep, unnatural chill that coiled around my skin like invisible fingers. The hallway stretched before me, dark and waiting. My bedroom door stood slightly ajar at the end of it. The knocking had stopped. I took another step. The lantern's glow flickered against the walls, casting shifting shadows that seemed to pulse with each breath I took. The silence was thick, pressing, waiting. Then, just as I reached the threshold, something whispered my name. It came from inside my bedroom. A shudder ran through me, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My body refused to obey. Every muscle locked in place as the silence stretched, thick and unnatural. Then slowly, so very slowly, the bedroom door creaked open just a little more. A handprint bloomed across the mirror inside. Dark, wet, pressed against the glass from within. The whisper came again, closer this time, curling around me like breath against my ear. "Let me in." The lantern flickered wildly in my grip, the flame bending as if something unseen had exhaled against it. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind me, locking whatever was inside back where it belonged. But deep in the walls of my house, the knocking started again. The knocking continued through the night, a constant, rhythmical sound that seemed to pierce the silence like a pulse. It wasn't just the walls anymore. The sound had moved, scattered across the house, as if the very bones of the place were trying to reach out. I could hear it near the kitchen, then closer to the bathroom, and again near the staircase. Knock, knock, knock. The hollow thud of something pressing against the framework of the house, each echo louder than the last. I didn't sleep. It would be impossible to. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching the lantern in my lap, eyes fixed on the door. It felt like something was watching me, even from within the house. The shadows moved strangely under the dim light, twisting and stretching with no logical reason. My own reflection in the window seemed to mock me, distorted in the glass as if trying to break free from the frame. By dawn, the knocking had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as oppressive. There was a stillness in the house now, a suffocating quiet that made me want to scream just to break it. The air was stale, thick with tension, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to do something. I needed answers. I reached for my phone. My hands shook as I dialed the number I had hoped never to call. It was the only number I had left, the number of the man who had been at the tunnel the night I found it. His name was Daniel, and while I didn't know him well, I knew he was someone who understood things I didn't, things I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The phone rang 3 times before it clicked to voicemail. I cursed under my breath, about to hang up, when the line clicked again. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as a voice, strained and low, came through the receiver. "You've opened something." The words hung in the air like a curse, a whisper I wasn't sure I'd heard correctly. The voice was familiar, but not in any comforting way. It was strained, almost frantic, like someone who knew too much and wanted to warn me, but couldn't. I pressed the phone harder to my ear. What do you mean? What did I open?" The voice on the other end didn't answer immediately. I could hear muffled sounds in the background like static, the shuffle of papers, or someone moving. Finally, it spoke again. "The tunnel. It's not just a tunnel. It's a doorway. A doorway to something else." My heart pounded in my chest. The whisper of the figure in the mirror, the knock on the walls, the feeling of something waiting inside my house. They all suddenly clicked together. I had opened something that I wasn't supposed to. I had invited whatever was in the tunnel into my world. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice cracking as the words left my mouth. What did I bring here? The voice on the phone grew even more strained, almost as if it was fading, slipping away. It's not from this world." There was a pause, then a deep, labored breath. "It's been looking for a way out. You've given it one. You have to stop it, or it will..." The line went dead. I stood frozen, staring at the phone in my hand. The world felt distant now, hazy. Every shadow in my house, every creak of the floorboards felt like a threat. Daniel's words echoed in my head, mixing with the whisper from the mirror. I had opened something, and now I was trapped in its wake. I didn't know how long I stood there, the phone still in my hand, the weight of his warning hanging over me like a guillotine waiting to fall. But eventually, I forced myself to move. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here anymore. I walked to the door, but just as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. The knock. It was louder this time, coming from inside the house, as if it were standing right behind me. The pressure against the walls was unbearable, as if the house itself were about to collapse under the weight of whatever I had unleashed. I froze. Then I turned around. I turned slowly, my heart racing, the lantern shaking in my hand as I scanned the room. The knocking had stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet again. The oppressive stillness returned, making the house feel even more alien, like it no longer belonged to me. It was as if something had already taken it over, its invisible presence lurking around every corner, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself fully. I stepped cautiously back into the living room, my breath shallow. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. But where would I go? The world beyond these walls felt distant, unreachable. The only reality now was this house, this twisted version of reality I found myself in, and the things I had unknowingly allowed in. As I moved toward the front door, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a small crack in the floorboards, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It was in the corner of the living room, near the fireplace. I knelt down, inspecting it more closely, my fingers trembling as I brushed away the dust. The crack wasn't just a fracture in the wood. It was a seam, something that had been hidden, waiting to be discovered. I hesitated. Something about it felt important, as if it were the key to understanding everything that had happened. But part of me was terrified of what I might find. Still, curiosity and a growing sense of desperation pushed me forward. I reached down, running my fingers along the edge of the crack, and to my surprise, it shifted. The wood panel lifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. It was a small space, just big enough for a few objects, and in it lay something that made my stomach turn. A bundle of old, tattered papers, their edges yellowed with age. My heart skipped a beat as I carefully picked them up, my hands unsteady as I began to unfold the topmost page. The writing was faded, but I could make out some of the words. Names, dates. But what struck me the most were the diagrams. They were sketches of the very tunnel I had discovered, its spiraling lines detailed in a way that made my skin crawl. The drawings weren't just random. They were deliberate, precise, as if someone had studied this place for years. I flipped through the papers, my mind racing. The sketches grew darker as I progressed, the symbols more intricate, the lines twisted in unnatural ways. There were references to doorways, paths between worlds, and something called the Key of the Hollow, but none of it made any sense. Then, I found a page that made my blood run cold. In the center of the page was a drawing of the house I was in now. My house, with a symbol scrawled across it. A symbol I recognized from the mirror's reflection, the one I had seen the first time I entered the tunnel. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. This house, the very place I had sought refuge in, was connected to whatever had been waiting in that tunnel. I was in more danger than I had ever realized. Suddenly, a sound broke through my panic, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate, like someone was pacing the length of the house. I spun around, but the room was empty. The front door, which I had left ajar only moments ago, was now shut tight. My chest tightened. I was not alone. The knocking started again. But this time it wasn't just the walls. It was the floor. It was the ceiling. It was everywhere. The house itself was alive, and I had awakened something far darker than I could ever have imagined. I looked back at the papers in my hands, the answer to everything sitting in front of me, but the words blurred together, my vision swimming as a cold dread took over. What had I done? What had I unleashed? The knock came again, louder this time, and with it, the unmistakable feeling that something was right behind me. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. But I knew that I had only one choice now. I had to face it. I stood frozen in place, the papers still clutched in my hand as the knocking grew louder. It reverberated through the house, a steady thud that seemed to come from every direction. I could feel the pressure mounting in the walls, as if the house itself were being compressed, Each echo a warning, a countdown. I glanced around the room, but nothing moved. No shadows stirred. Yet the feeling of someone watching me was undeniable. The fear that had settled in my chest was no longer a mere discomfort. It was suffocating, thickening the air around me until I could barely breathe. The house felt more like a trap than a home, its walls closing in with every passing second. I looked down at the papers, hoping they would hold the answers, hoping they would explain what was happening. But all they did was offer more questions. There was no mention of what to do next, no guidance on how to close the doorway I had opened. The drawings were cryptic, their meaning elusive. The symbol on the page, the one that matched the reflection in the mirror, was the only constant, the only thread that tied everything together. But I had no idea how to undo what had been done. I moved slowly toward the hallway, the floor creaking underfoot, and began to search the house. I had to find something, anything, that might help me understand what was happening. The knocking continued, but it seemed to have settled into a rhythm now, almost like the house itself was trying to communicate. I checked every room, every closet, even the attic, but nothing stood out. Everything seemed as it had been before, except for one thing: the feeling. The presence that I couldn't shake, that feeling that someone was following me, no matter where I went. It was in the walls. It was in the air. It was in the very foundation of the house. As I reached the basement door, I hesitated. The basement had always been an eerie place, even before any of this started. There was a heaviness to it, a sense that whatever was down there had been left alone for a reason. But now, with the knocking growing louder and the house feeling more suffocating by the second, I had no choice. I had to confront it. I descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. The air in the basement was damp, cool, and stale, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. But beneath that, there was something else, something sharper, more metallic. I could taste it on my tongue. It was the same feeling I had experienced when I first entered the tunnel, a sensation that something was there, waiting. The basement was dark, save for the faint light from the stairs. I reached for the lantern in my hand, but it flickered and sputtered, as if protesting the very act of being used. I had no choice but to push forward. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness as I made my way deeper into the room. I knew that I was not alone. There, in the far corner of the basement, was a door. It was old, weathered, and sealed shut with iron bolts. I didn't remember it being there before. I had lived in this house for years, and I was certain that this door hadn't existed when I moved in. My pulse quickened as I approached it, the air thickening with each step. I hesitated, staring at the door. The knocking was louder now, as if it were coming from beyond it, from the other side. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a decision. I knew that whatever lay behind that door was the source of everything. The tunnel, the presence, the haunting that had slowly turned my life into a nightmare. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. But just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the door creaked open on its own. The darkness behind it was absolute, deeper than anything I had ever seen. There was no light, no sound, only the vast emptiness that seemed to stretch forever. I could feel it though, the pull of it, the sense that whatever lay beyond was not just darkness. It was something else, something alive. I stepped forward, drawn into the abyss. The door opened with a screech that seemed to tear the air apart, and I found myself standing at the threshold of something far more sinister than I could have imagined. The darkness behind it wasn't simply the absence of light. It was an oppressive force, a void that seemed to devour everything in its path. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice, peering into an abyss that stretched endlessly, swallowing up any hope, any trace of sanity that had once been mine. I took a hesitant step forward, my body compelled by an invisible force. The air in the basement had grown colder, far colder than the damp chill of the room had any right to be. It bit at my skin, seeping through my clothes, and I shivered uncontrollably. I reached out with a shaking hand, but the darkness was impenetrable. There was nothing tangible, no texture, nothing to grasp onto. It felt as if the very air itself had turned to something thick and suffocating. The knocking stopped. And for a moment, everything was silent. A strange calm settled over me, like the quiet before a storm. I was no longer aware of the house, no longer aware of the ticking clock or the sound of my own breath. My world had shrunk down to this doorway, to the hollow blackness waiting just beyond. The weight of it pressed down on me, pushing me further into the darkness, forcing me to look into the abyss. And then something stirred. At first, it was so subtle that I almost missed it. A faint whisper, like the rustling of pages in the wind. But it wasn't wind. It was something more, something closer. The whisper wasn't carried by the air. It was inside my head, worming its way into my thoughts. My body tensed, instinctively trying to retreat, but my feet refused to move. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't words, not at first, but a kind of low hum, vibrating through the very air around me. It was coming from within the darkness. My breath quickened as the hum shifted, transformed into a voice. Not a single voice, but a chorus, disembodied, overlapping, as though countless souls were speaking at once. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but the emotion behind the words was unmistakable. Desperation. Pain. The unmistakable scent of madness. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but there was something inside me, something that had taken root in the deepest corners of my mind, that urged me to stay, to listen, to learn. Another step forward, and I felt it, a pull, subtle yet unrelenting. The darkness began to feel less like an absence and more like a presence, wrapping itself around me like tendrils, drawing me into its depths. It was a force that thrived on fear, on confusion, and on helplessness. And it knew that I was all three. I had to fight it, but how? I reached for the lantern, but its feeble light flickered weakly, then died, leaving me in complete darkness. A sense of vertigo hit me, and for a moment I thought I might lose my balance. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but when I opened them again, the darkness seemed to have shifted. It was no longer just in front of me, it was inside me. It was in my thoughts, in my veins, in my very soul. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They surrounded me, as though they were pressing in from every side, their whispers clawing at the edges of my mind, trying to pull me deeper into their world. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something in the darkness, something moving. A figure, barely discernible at first, but as it drew closer, I could make out its shape. It was human, but distorted, twisted. The features of its face were an unsettling combination of both familiar and alien. Eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light, a mouth that stretched too wide, too thin, like it was trying to smile, but was incapable of human expression. And there was something about its presence, something ancient, something that existed long before I had stepped into this house, before I had even known about the tunnel. The figure took another step forward, and the darkness around it seemed to pulse, like the very ground beneath my feet was alive, shifting in response to its movement. I couldn't breathe. My legs were frozen, my body paralyzed. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this moment, caught in its grip, unable to break free. The figure extended a hand toward me, its fingers elongated sharp. It reached into the air like it was reaching for something, someone, me. And then it spoke, not in a language I could understand, but in a voice that crawled under my skin, whispering my name, drawing me into its world. You shouldn't have come. The words echoed, reverberating in my head, filling me with an overwhelming sense of dread. But before I could react, the figure lunged forward, and the darkness swallowed me whole. I awoke, but not as I had expected. I had expected to be back in the basement, the walls pressing in around me, the darkness still curling like a predator waiting to strike. Instead, I found myself lying on a cold, smooth surface. The air around me was thick, still, and unnervingly silent. My senses felt heightened, as if I were more aware than ever before of every single inch of my body, every sound, every movement, or lack thereof. I sat up slowly, my head swimming with disorientation. My surroundings were unfamiliar, but there was something about them that felt wrong, I was in a place that seemed to exist outside of time, a space that was suspended in some undefined void. The ground beneath me was not earth, nor stone, nor anything that could be described in familiar terms. It felt like a membrane, something thin and almost alive. My hands trembled as I touched it, feeling an odd warmth that seeped into my skin, sending an electric pulse through my veins. It wasn't the warmth of a comforting embrace. No, it was the warmth of something that was aware of me, something that was waiting. I glanced around. There were no walls, no ceiling, no floor to speak of. Just a vast, undulating expanse that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. It was as if I were suspended in space itself, unable to orient myself. The only thing that kept me grounded was the eerie sense of something else, something out there just beyond the reach of my senses. But what was it? And where was it? I stood, my legs wobbling with the effort, and I instinctively began to walk. It wasn't a conscious decision. Something inside me was pushing me forward, urging me to move. But the farther I went, the more I began to feel that I wasn't moving at all. The space around me remained unchanged, as though I were trapped in an endless loop, walking forever without ever reaching any destination. No sound, no time, nothing. A familiar chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the absence of light, the absence of sound. It was the oppressive silence that smothered everything around me. It was as if I were drowning in a vacuum, suffocating from the very lack of everything I had once taken for granted. My breathing quickened. The sense of isolation, the cold void pressing in from all sides, began to claw at my mind. I tried to call out, but no words came. I opened my mouth, my throat raw with the effort, but it felt like my voice was being absorbed by the very air around me. There was no sound to fill the silence, no echo of my words to prove I was even here. I was forgotten. As I continued to stumble forward, the disorienting feeling of being watched settled over me again. But this time, it wasn't just a vague sense. It was tangible, suffocating. It wasn't a distant presence. It was here with me. I could feel eyes on me, though there was no one to be seen. I shuddered involuntarily. My skin crawled, my heart raced. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the distance. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the mind. But no, it was there, unyielding, perfectly still. Its form was barely distinguishable, a blur against the void. But its presence was undeniable. It was watching me, or perhaps waiting for me to approach. I wasn't sure why, but I moved toward it. It was as if my body had already decided for me, as if I had no other choice. The closer I came, the more I could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. The figure remained motionless, even as I drew nearer. There was no sound, no movement. The void seemed to grow colder, more oppressive with each step I took. My body trembled with the anticipation of what was to come, my mind torn between fear and curiosity. What was this figure? What was it waiting for? I reached out a hand toward it, my fingers trembling, and in that instant the figure turned. It didn't move like a human. It was as if it existed in a different dimension, its motion a strange and unnatural thing. It didn't walk, it shifted. One moment it was in front of me, the next it was directly beside me, an entity that bent the very fabric of space itself. It spoke then, its voice not a sound, but an intrusion. The words it whispered curled into my mind, sinking deep into my thoughts. You are lost, and you will never be found. Not here, not ever. The chill of those words wrapped around me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The reality of what I was experiencing, the inescapable weight of the void, the absolute silence, the absence of everything familiar, began to crush me. I had stepped into something far darker than I had ever imagined, and now there was no escape, no way back. I was lost, and I had no idea how I would ever find my way out. Time, I had learned, was a concept that no longer applied to this place. What felt like hours, or was it minutes, had passed since I encountered the figure in the void, but there was no way to gauge the passage of time. It had stopped mattering. the absence of light, the absence of sound, had conspired to create a reality where everything was suspended, hanging in an endless state of waiting. The words of the figure echoed in my mind, looping like an incessant mantra. You are lost, and you will never be found. Not here, not ever. The weight of those words threatened to crush me, to strip me of my sanity, but I fought to hold on to something, anything. I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out. I couldn't just give up. But where could I go? The space around me was infinite in its emptiness. There were no landmarks, no sense of direction. The air, if it could even be called that, was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the very breath of this place had been stolen. My footsteps made no sound. My movements felt muted, as if I were drifting through water. Each step seemed to push me farther into the unknown, but I was no closer to understanding what this place was or why I was trapped in it. I had no idea how long I had been wandering, but soon the oppressive silence began to gnaw at my mind. It wasn't just the void that felt wrong. It was the sensation of being watched that lingered in the air. At first, it had been a vague sense of unease, the faintest feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond my reach. But now it was tangible, suffocating. I could almost feel the gaze of countless unseen eyes, following my every movement. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, charged with an unseen presence. I turned, instinctively scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Only the stillness. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakably there. It wasn't the voice of the figure from before. No, this was something else, something that felt closer. The words were unintelligible at first, a jumble of sounds that seemed to slither into my ears like a serpent, winding around my thoughts. I strained to make sense of them, but they remained just out of reach, a constant presence that tugged at the edges of my mind. The whisper grew louder, clearer, as if it were coming from all around me. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, a chorus of hushed murmurs, each one distinct, yet somehow blending together into an unholy harmony. The words were still incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a threat, a promise of something far worse. I felt my pulse quicken as the whispers intensified, their rhythm becoming more frantic, more insistent. It was as though the voices were trying to tear through the silence, to break it open. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice had long since abandoned me. I was powerless, trapped in the suffocating grip of this place and its relentless, whispering inhabitants. In the midst of the cacophony, a sudden realization struck me. The voices weren't just speaking to me. They were speaking through me. They were pulling at my thoughts, twisting my mind, trying to force their way into my consciousness. It was as if the very fabric of my being was being rewritten, as if my thoughts were no longer my own. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let this place break me. I had to fight back, to keep my mind intact, even as it felt like the whispers were eroding my sanity. My hands gripped my head, my fingers digging into my skull as if I could stop the invasion. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent. And then, amidst the chaos of voices, something changed. The whispers suddenly halted, leaving behind an unsettling silence. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to hear something. Anything. But there was only the absence of sound. It was as if the very space around me had become hollow, devoid of life. For a moment, I thought the worst had passed. But I was wrong. The silence was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that suffocated, the kind that pressed in on you until you couldn't breathe. And then, a new voice emerged, different from the others. It was clear, sharp, commanding, as though it came from somewhere deep within the void. "You have not escaped," it said, its words slicing through the silence like a blade. "This is your fate now. There is no way out. There is no hope." I staggered back, the weight of those words crushing me. The air around me seemed to warp, to bend under the pressure of that voice, as if the very essence of this place had been altered by it. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I wasn't just lost in this space. I was being consumed by it. It wasn't just the darkness that surrounded me. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for me. The void was not a place of emptiness. It was a place of hunger, and I was the prey. What does it mean to be forgotten? Does it feel like the void I now inhabit? Is the lack of sound and sensation simply a reflection of something deeper? That which lies hidden beneath the skin of memory, where everything once known dissolves into irretrievable oblivion. In the oppressive silence of this realm, I began to grasp a horrifying truth. The void I was trapped in was not empty. It was filled with the remains of those who had come before me, swallowed by this unseen force. Forgotten, erased, consumed. There were moments, fleeting flashes, where I caught glimpses of their faces, their twisted forms, visions distorted by the darkness and the pressure of the place. They were figures whose names had long since disappeared, whose stories had been buried beneath layers of time and suffering. But their eyes, I could still see their eyes, wide with terror, locked in an eternal stare that seemed to demand something from me. Were they begging for help, or was it too late for that? Had they, too, been consumed by the same force that now clutched at my very being? I shuddered as the realization settled over me. I was not alone. Not now, and not ever. The void was not an absence. It was a tomb, a mausoleum of lost souls, each one trapped in its endless hunger, never to be freed. These poor wretches, they were still here, their flesh intertwined with the very essence of this place. They had not escaped. They had not been saved. Their agony lived on, embedded in the very fabric of the void. For the first time since I had entered this nightmare, I felt something other than dread. It was an overwhelming, visceral revulsion, a deep sickness that came from knowing I had become part of this macabre collection. I could feel the weight of their presence in every corner of my mind, their pain seeping through the cracks of my consciousness like poison. I couldn't escape them, not in body or spirit. This place, this endless void, was designed to devour everything, and not just in the physical sense. It consumed memories, hope, and most terrifyingly, the very essence of one's identity. I had to escape, but how? I had tried everything, from shouting into the endless abyss to running aimlessly in search of an exit that would never come. There were no doors, no windows, no paths. Only the crushing weight of an existence without end. It was the kind of horror that gnawed at your soul, the kind that erased your very ability to dream of a way out. You simply ceased to be, and yet there was something more, something in the way the darkness seemed to shift in response to my movements. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight ripple in the air, a change in the direction of the void's gaze. But as the moments dragged on, I realized that this was not the aimless wandering of an empty space. The void was watching, waiting for me to take the next step. I remembered the whispers, the voices that had spoken through me. They were not just random echoes. They were the voices of the forgotten. They had been here longer than I had, trapped in this endless purgatory, and they knew the rules. They knew what it meant to be consumed by this place. And now, they had turned their attention to me. I was no longer an intruder. I was a part of the collection, a new piece added to the grotesque mosaic of lost souls. I took a step forward, my feet moving against the invisible force that seemed to press against me. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if the very act of moving required more energy than I had to give. The whispers grew louder, no longer fragmented but whole sentences, entire conversations. But they weren't speaking to me. They were speaking through me, through my thoughts, weaving themselves into my very consciousness. A chilling thought crossed my mind. Was I becoming one of them? Was my essence, my soul, being drawn into the fabric of this void, becoming part of the hunger that consumed all who entered? Could I still escape? Or had I already been claimed? The voices in my mind seemed to mock me, as if to say, "It's too late. You are one of us now. There is no return." I stumbled, my vision blurring as the weight of that realization pressed down on me. Was I already lost? Had I crossed a line from which there was no return? I had thought I could fight this, thought that my will, my determination to survive would be enough. But in the face of this overwhelming force, I was beginning to see the futility of resistance. I was no different from the others, just another forgotten soul, trapped in a place where time had no meaning, where memory was a distant illusion. And then, amidst the crushing despair, I heard something else, a voice, distinct and unmistakable. It wasn't the chorus of whispers. It wasn't the void itself speaking to me. No, this voice was different. It was clear, filled with purpose, and it spoke with an authority that cut through the chaos. You will not be forgotten. Not yet. The voice felt like a lifeline, a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. But what did it mean? Was it a trick? A new voice in this sea of insanity? Or was it someone offering me a way out? It wasn't clear, but it was something. And that was enough to give me the strength to keep going. The voices of the forgotten grew silent for a moment, as if they, too, were listening. The presence of the voice in my mind was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that had surrounded me. It was a flicker of light in an endless, consuming darkness. But now, I knew what I had to do. I had to find the source of that voice. If there was a chance, any chance of escaping this place, I had to pursue it. The void may have consumed all who had come before me, but I would not be just another forgotten soul. Not without a fight. The voice had ignited something in me, a spark of defiance that I thought I had lost to the crushing weight of the void. The absence that had surrounded me for so long now felt different, less oppressive, though still unnerving. It was as though the very air around me had thickened, giving me substance, a fleeting sense of reality in a place that had none. The darkness had always been more than mere absence. It was the embodiment of everything forgotten, a graveyard of souls trapped in time, unable to break free from their fates. Yet now there was something new in it, a possibility, an opening. I moved forward, but each step felt heavier, not from the physical strain, but from the mental toll. The more I focused on the shifting presence of the voice, the less I could trust my senses. The void seemed to distort itself in response to my thoughts, twisting the ground beneath my feet, making the path ahead unclear. Was I walking straight, or was the world around me warping? Every inch I moved felt like I was losing more of my sense of direction. There was no up or down, no left or right. Just the endless expanse of darkness that reached in every direction. Yet I could feel something pulling me, faint but insistent. A force that wasn't born of the void, but rather seemed to fight against it. For the first time, I questioned the nature of this place. Was it truly just a void of oblivion, or was it something else entirely? Perhaps this was not a realm that merely consumed, it created too. Could this place be shaping me, molding me into something different, something more? The thought both terrified and intrigued me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules here were not fixed. They were malleable, bending like the path that I was walking, a path I was shaping with each step. It was as though the very act of my movement was rewriting the space itself, giving it a form that had been absent for so long. The whispers, which had once filled every corner of my mind, began to fade as I moved. But they didn't vanish entirely. No, they lingered, not in my mind, but in the air around me. They had taken on a different tone, an unsettling one, as if they were waiting for me to realize something crucial, something that would forever alter my understanding of this place. I paused, my heart racing, as the whispers turned into words. "You are becoming part of the path," they hissed. "There is no turning back now." The meaning of their words struck me with a cold finality. Becoming part of the path. I felt it deep within me. The ground beneath me no longer felt like earth, or even some faceless surface. It felt alive, organic, pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored my heartbeat, as if the path was breathing, growing, adapting to my presence. The voices were right. I was becoming part of this place, not just a visitor or a prisoner, but something intrinsically tied to its very existence. My thoughts raced as I continued to move forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to escape before it was too late. But I couldn't. I had come too far, and there was no going back. I had already crossed the threshold from which there was no return. The path ahead was no longer about finding an escape. It was about understanding what this place was, what it wanted from me, and whether or not I could survive whatever it had planned. The darkness around me shifted once again, but this time, it wasn't just the usual malleable shadows. No, this was something more deliberate, more calculated. I had thought the void was unfeeling, but now it seemed to react to me. The walls of the space began to tighten, narrowing the path until I was almost forced to squeeze through the unyielding walls. The sensation was suffocating, as though the very void itself was attempting to consume me whole. I stumbled, my breath quickening as I pushed forward, but the walls continued to press in, squeezing the air from my lungs. It was then that I heard it again, the voice, no longer distant but close, so close that it felt as if it were inside my very skull. "You must choose," it whispered. "The path ahead is not the same as the one behind. What you seek will demand a sacrifice." The words were not just spoken. They were felt like a physical presence pushing against me, shaking me from the inside out. The sacrifice. What did it mean? Was the void offering me a choice? Or was it simply warning me of what lay ahead, preparing me for something far worse than what I had already encountered? I gritted my teeth, fighting to stay calm. The whispers of the forgotten continued to swirl around me, their voices growing louder as the path before me twisted and turned, changing with every step. I had no choice but to follow it, to find out what lay at the end of this trail. What choice did I have? The void was consuming everything, and I was already part of it. If I turned back, I would never escape the endless cycle of confusion and torment. No, the only way forward was through, no matter the cost. The passage ahead seemed endless. The walls of the void pressed in tighter and tighter, as though they were closing around me, suffocating me in their dark embrace. I could no longer distinguish between the whispers of the past and the voice that had guided me. Were they one and the same? Was the voice simply another part of the void, manipulating me, playing with my mind? Or had it been something else all along, something real, trying to pull me out of the abyss? And then, just as I thought I could no longer endure the pressure, the voice spoke again, this time clearer than ever before. "The path will not end until you give of yourself. Only then will you be free." I paused, the weight of its words settling over me like a blanket of cold dread. What did it mean? What was I being asked to give? And could I afford to give it? As the voice's final words echoed through the suffocating silence of the void, a strange calm washed over me. It was as if I had crossed some invisible threshold, one that bound me to this place in ways I had yet to understand. The concept of sacrifice now loomed over me, its weight pressing down on my chest with the force of 1,000 unspoken truths. What did I have left to give? I had already lost so much. My sense of reality, my grasp on time, and even my identity seemed to have frayed at the edges. The very essence of who I was had been eaten away by this place, leaving me a shell, a mere echo of my former self. Was there anything left to sacrifice? Could I afford to give more? The path ahead twisted again, almost imperceptibly at first, but with every step I took, the subtle shifts became more pronounced. The walls of this void, which had once felt like an oppressive force, now seemed to reach out toward me, responding to my thoughts and movements. It was as if the very fabric of this place had become attuned to my presence, reading my every hesitation and decision. With each passing second, the air grew heavier, thick with an energy that pulsed around me, as though the very ground itself was alive. Was this the sacrifice the voice had spoken of? The void seemed to demand something more from me than just physical movement. It wanted my essence, my soul, my very will to exist, and I was unsure if I could resist. I could feel a growing pressure within me, an overwhelming sense that my time was running out. The path seemed to stretch endlessly forward, but each step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into some dark, unseen pit. The walls of the void, which had once seemed unyielding, now seemed to constrict around me, as though they were testing my resolve, probing my thoughts for any sign of weakness. The voice had said that I must give something in order to proceed, But I was beginning to realize that the true nature of the sacrifice was far more insidious than I could have imagined. As I moved forward, the sense of being watched became more pronounced. It was not just the whispers of the forgotten that seemed to surround me now. No, this was something else entirely, a presence that was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The air thickened with anticipation, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the unknown pressing down on me. What lay ahead? What was this place, truly, and why had it brought me here? I could no longer trust my own thoughts, my own senses. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to some unfathomable truth, but with each step, I also felt further from who I once was. The walls narrowed once again, forcing me into a confined space. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing colder with each passing second. It was as if the very essence of this place was growing more hostile, more unforgiving. The path ahead twisted in on itself, creating a maze that I could no longer decipher. I had once thought that I could find a way out, but now, the very idea of escape seemed absurd. There was no way back. The only direction left was forward, into whatever horrors awaited me. I felt the heavy weight of the choice that loomed before me, the sacrifice that was required for passage. What was I truly willing to give up in order to survive? I could hear the voice again, faint at first, but growing louder with each breath I took. "You have already given much, but there is more to be done," it whispered. "You must decide. Will you become part of the void, or will you break free?" The words carried a chilling finality, as though my fate was already sealed. The question seemed simple, but in the depth of the void, it was anything but. What did it mean to become part of the void? Was it a complete surrender of self, an acceptance of oblivion? Or was it something more, a chance to become something greater, to transcend the limitations of flesh and time? I had no answers, only the growing sense of dread that clung to my every thought. The walls pressed in around me again, this time with a physical force that I could feel against my skin, as if they were pushing me toward an inevitable end. My breathing quickened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The very air seemed to be thick with the weight of decision, as though it were urging me to choose, to decide what I was willing to give. My mind raced, but each thought only led to more questions, more uncertainties. There was no clarity, only confusion. But then, a flicker of something familiar stirred deep within me. It was faint at first, like a spark in the darkness, but it was there, a memory, a feeling of something that I had lost. I couldn't place it, but it was as if a part of me that had been absent for so long had suddenly reawakened. The void around me seemed to recoil at this, as if it were reacting to the resurgence of whatever it was that stirred within me. The pressure around me intensified, and I could feel the walls pushing harder, as if trying to crush this newfound resistance. It was a battle now, a struggle for control, for identity, for whatever shred of humanity remained within me. "Choose," the voice urged again, its tone growing more insistent. "You cannot hold on forever. There is no other way forward." The decision weighed heavily on me. I knew what I had to do, though I didn't understand why it had to be this way. The path forward demanded something, everything, from me, and I had no choice but to give it. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. The walls continued to press in, and the air grew colder still. With a final, decisive step, I let go of what I had been holding on to, allowing the void to claim me once more. In that moment, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I knew that I had made my choice. But I also knew that the price I had paid would haunt me forever. And whatever came next, I would not be the same. The void had claimed a part of me, but in return, it had given me something else. Something I could not yet comprehend. Something that would change everything. As I stood at the precipice of whatever awaited beyond the void, the reality of my decision began to settle into my bones. The oppressive darkness that had surrounded me now felt strangely distant, as though it were a part of someone else's story. The air above was different, fresher, lighter, but it came with its own weight. The heaviness that had permeated my every moment within the tunnels now lingered around me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the bargain I had struck. I had given something of myself to this place, something precious that could never be returned. Yet the sensation of being changed, of being more, was undeniable. I was no longer just a wanderer lost in a maze of time and space. I had crossed a threshold, and now I was something else entirely. The surface, this place beyond the tunnel, did not look as I had expected. I had envisioned light breaking through, an expanse of wide, open space, perhaps even the soothing touch of nature that had once been the balm to my troubled mind. Instead, it was barren. Gray skies hung overhead like a shroud, and the ground beneath me was cracked, dried out, as though it had not known the warmth of rain in centuries. The landscape stretched out in all directions, lifeless and desolate. The very air seemed to carry a kind of static charge, as though the world itself was waiting, suspended in an eternal moment of uncertainty. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stepped forward, each footfall echoing louder than the last. The silence that enveloped me was profound, the kind of silence that felt suffocating, pressing down on me from every direction. I had expected to find some kind of solace here, some release from the horrors of the tunnels, but instead, I was confronted with the stark reality of my own isolation. The journey had changed me, yes, but had it led me to something better? Had I emerged from the darkness only to find another kind of prison? I surveyed the landscape more closely, my mind racing to make sense of this new world. There were no signs of life, no birds in the sky, no animals skittering across the ground. It was as though the land itself had been abandoned, stripped of everything that once made it whole. What kind of place was this? Had the tunnels led me to a realm of forgotten memories? Or was this the world as it truly was, broken and scarred by some unseen catastrophe? My thoughts spiraled as I wandered through the barren expanse, each step feeling like a drift further from any sense of security. The realization came slowly at first, like a creeping fog that I could not push away. The void had not simply altered my perceptions. It had fundamentally reshaped the very nature of my existence. I could feel it in the air around me, in the vibrations that seemed to ripple through the ground. Something had changed. I had changed. I had emerged from the tunnel not as the person who had entered, but as something else, something that was no longer fully tethered to the physical world. It was as though I had become an extension of the place itself, a being caught between two realities, neither fully alive nor entirely dead. I tried to call out, to break the silence that had come to feel more like a prison than a release, but my voice was swallowed by the stillness. There was no echo, no response. It was as though the very sound of my existence had been absorbed by the emptiness. For the first time, I questioned whether I had truly escaped. Was I free, or had I simply moved from one form of captivity to another? The weight of this uncertainty pressed down on me, and I stumbled, feeling as though I might collapse under its force. The ground beneath me shifted, and I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Had the void found me again? Was I being pulled back, dragged into the depths once more? But when I looked down, I saw that it was not the earth that was moving. It was my own body, shaking, trembling, as though something inside me was trying to break free. The sensation was foreign, unsettling. It was as though my body no longer belonged to me, as though the price I had paid had not only altered my mind, but had changed the very fabric of my being. The air grew heavier once again, a strange pressure building in my chest. The landscape around me blurred, and I could feel my vision faltering. Was I truly here? Or had I become lost in another illusion, another trick of the mind that the void had set before me? I reached out for something, anything, to ground myself, but there was nothing. The emptiness stretched before me, endless and overwhelming. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the distance, standing just on the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a product of my frayed nerves and the weight of the journey I had undertaken. But the figure did not fade. It stood still, as though waiting for me. I felt a pull, an undeniable compulsion to move toward it, to discover what it was, what it could possibly mean. My steps were slow at first, hesitant, as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The closer I got, the more distinct the figure became, and with it, a strange sense of recognition began to stir within me. This was not a person I knew, but it was someone or something that seemed connected to me in a way I could not explain. I had no choice but to approach. The distance between us closed, and with each step, I felt a strange sense of being both drawn to and repelled by the figure. It was as if the ground itself shifted beneath my feet, urging me forward even as my instincts screamed at me to turn back. Finally, I stood before it, face to face with the thing that had emerged from the emptiness. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and alien, it spoke. "You have returned, but what will you do with the power you've gained? What will you become?" The question hung in the air, its weight crushing down on me. I had crossed through the darkness, paid the price of passage, but now I was faced with the consequences. What had I truly become? Was I ready to confront the nature of the transformation I had undergone, or had the void irrevocably altered me in ways I could never fully understand? The figure before me seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though its very presence was both solid and ephemeral. It stood motionless, unyielding, as if awaiting an answer to a question that had never been asked before, but one that had always been implied. The words it spoke echoed in my mind, reverberating with a force that made it difficult to distinguish between thought and reality. "What will you become?" it had asked. The question was simple, yet it carried with it a weight that I could not escape. In the silence that followed, I tried to grasp the enormity of the moment, to wrap my mind around the choice that lay before me. I had spent so long in the darkness, wandering through the tunnels, trying to find something, anything, that could give meaning to my existence. But now, in the face of this figure, this embodiment of the very forces I had encountered, I understood that the journey had not been about escaping the darkness or finding a way out. It had been about understanding. The tunnels, the void, the silence. They had all been tests, trials designed to force me to confront myself in ways I could never have imagined. I had changed, yes. I had emerged from the depths of the unknown, but I was no longer the person who had entered. The void had not just altered my perceptions. It had stripped away the illusions I had clung to. It had shown me the fragility of my identity, the tenuous nature of the boundaries I had built around myself. But now, standing before this figure, I realized that the true test was not in surviving the journey, but in choosing what to do with the power I had gained, the power to shape my own existence, to define my own path in a world that seemed to have no rules. The air around me grew colder, and I felt the weight of the figure's gaze upon me, as if it were peeling back the layers of my soul. I had no answers, no clear understanding of what was happening, but I knew that this moment, this encounter, was the culmination of everything I had experienced. The choice was mine, but what could I choose? Could I go back to the world I had once known, the life I had lived before the tunnels, before the journey? Or had I become something entirely new, something beyond the limitations of the world I had left behind? As I stood there, caught between these two possibilities, I felt a shift within me. The power, the strange energy I had sensed earlier, seemed to grow stronger, as if it were calling to me, urging me to embrace it. But at the same time, I could feel the remnants of my former self, the fears, the doubts, the desires for a simpler life, fighting to hold on, to keep me tethered to what I had known. I was torn, stretched between two realities, unsure of which path to take. The figure, sensing my indecision, stepped closer. Its form remained indistinct, like a shadow in the periphery of my vision. Yet its presence was undeniable. "You have already made a choice," it said, its voice as steady and unyielding as the earth itself. "The question is not what you will become, but whether you are willing to accept the consequences of that choice. You are no longer bound by the rules of the world you left behind. You have transcended them. But what will you do with that freedom?" The weight of those words struck me with a force that left me breathless. Freedom. The word had once been a distant dream, a vague notion of escape, of liberation from the constraints of society, of life itself. But now, it seemed to carry a far deeper meaning. I had spent so long searching for answers, for a way out of the darkness. But what if the true answer had always been within me? What if the journey had never been about finding a way out, but about understanding that the only real prison was the one I had created for myself? I could feel the energy pulsing through me, the sensation growing stronger with each passing moment. It was as though my very being was resonating with the forces that had shaped the void, with the dark power that had driven me to this place. And yet, even as it called to me, I felt a sudden sense of clarity, a sense that I had been given a choice, not just between two paths, but between two versions of myself. The journey had not been about escaping the darkness, but about confronting it and learning to live with it. Your true self, the figure continued, is not bound by time or space. It exists beyond the limits of the physical world. But the question remains, what will you do with that knowledge? Will you return to the world you once knew, with all its limitations and constraints? Or will you embrace the freedom you now possess and become something greater than yourself? I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the question wash over me. For so long, I had sought answers in the tunnels, in the darkness, in the void. But now, in this moment, I understood that the answer had always been within me. The tunnels had not changed me. They had only revealed what had always been hidden beneath the surface: the fear, the uncertainty, the longing for something more. And now, I had the power to choose. I could remain bound by the fears of my past, by the limitations of the world I had known, or I could step into the unknown, embracing the power that had awakened within me. The choice was mine, and as I stepped forward, I realized that there was no right or wrong answer. There was only the choice to be made and the consequences of that choice. The figure before me dissolved into the air, its presence fading like a dream upon waking. And as I stood alone in the barren landscape, I felt the pull of something new, a sense of freedom, of possibility, of potential. The tunnels had not been the end. They had been the beginning. And now, it was up to me to decide what came next. In the end, the journey had not been about escaping the darkness. It had been about understanding it, accepting it, and using it to forge a new path. And as I moved forward, I knew that whatever awaited me, I was no longer afraid. The void had revealed its secrets, and I had embraced them. The power I had gained was mine to wield, and it was up to me to decide what I would become.